When you look at an accountant's ledger for a major business, there is this fundamental expectation of just absolute airtight precision.
Right.
You have your credit column on the left, your debit column on the right.
Yeah, the numbers are in black and red.
Exactly. And the math balances out, and the accountant just points to the bottom line and says, there it is. That is the objective reality of our situation.
Right, it's undeniable.
And we naturally crave that exact same clarity when it comes to human progress. We want to see exactly what we gained as a society and exactly what we paid for it. But when you step into the history of the American West specifically, the monumental mid-century engineering of its river systems, that ledger starts to look completely warped.
Yeah, it really does. It resembles a set of heavily cooked books, honestly.
Right.
Because we're looking at a 70-year span where the ledger for the massive watersheds of the Columbia, the Snake, and the Klamath rivers, it appeared to be an absolute perfect balance.
But it was an illusion.
Totally an illusion. And it worked because the massive profits of this system were built out of millions of tons of solid concrete. They were towering hundreds of feet above the waterline where everyone could literally just stand there and marvel at them.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the staggering debts of this project, they were accumulating silently, entirely out of sight, beneath the surface of the water.
So today, we're taking you deep into a source dossier that cracks open those books. We are pulling from public domain, government reports, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, the Army Corps of Engineers.
The Northwest Power and Conservation Council, too.
Right, yeah. And we're layering those official documents with peer-reviewed biological studies on river ecosystems and fish parasitology alongside investigative political journalism from the Washington Post.
It's a massive amount of material.
It is. And the mission of this deep dive is to look at this history not as environmental activists or industrial apologists, but as honest accountants. We want to understand how a massive biological system was managed with a sort of mid-century blind ignorance, which then slowly, methodically transitioned into a very modern, conscious political indifference.
And the culmination of that shift, it's just undeniable. It builds over decades, largely unnoticed by the general public, until a single week in September 2002.
The Klamath River.
Exactly. That was the moment the river's ledger violently and visibly flipped in plain sight on those gravel bars.
Yeah.
But to truly understand why that crash happened, I mean, we really have to understand the momentum behind the machine. We have to look at the credits.
So let's put some black ink on this ledger.
Let's do it.
You don't pour millions of tons of concrete across a continent just for fun. We have to credit the benefits of these dams fully and without an ounce of modern irony.
Right. You have to put yourself in the shoes of a civil engineer in the mid-20th century.
Exactly. Because they genuinely believed they were saving human lives and taming a completely wild, hostile frontier. And the absolute biggest, most undeniable credit they delivered was flood control. A wild river is not a serene painting. It is a terrifying, lethal force of nature.
It really is. And the true horror of a wild river was permanently etched into the psyche of the Pacific Northwest on Memorial Day, 1948.
The Vanport flood.
Right. The conditions leading up to that day created just a perfect meteorological trap. The Columbia River Basin relies heavily on snowmelt from the mountains.
Yeah.
And that year there was a very heavy winter snowpack, but it was locked in place by an unusually cold spring.
So it didn't melt gradually.
Exactly. The snow didn't run off through April and May like it normally would. It was held in suspended animation up in the mountains, and then suddenly, a warm rain front moved in across the entire region.
Oh, wow. So you have all this delayed snow melt suddenly liquefying all at once. The rain is melting the snow, the ground is completely saturated, and all of that immense volume has only one place to go, rushing straight down into the Columbia River.
Yeah, the river swelled to roughly twice its average spring volume, and sitting directly in the path of this swollen giant was Vanport, Oregon.
Which was huge at the time.
It was the state's second largest city.
Wow.
It had been rapidly constructed as a wartime housing development for shipyard workers, and by 1948, it was home to tens of thousands of people. It also included Oregon's largest African-American community.
And geographically, it was in a terrible spot.
Terrible. The entire city sat on low-lying land, protected from the river only by a railroad embankment levee.
Oh, man.
Yeah. On May 30th, the sheer hydrostatic pressure of the swollen Columbia proved too much. The embankment simply gave way.
It wasn't just a gradual leak, though. It was a catastrophic structural failure.
Completely.
In less than a day, an entire city of tens of thousands of people was essentially erased from the map. At least 51 people died in the floodwaters, and tens of thousands were rendered instantly homeless, literally scrambling for their lives with whatever they could carry.
Just a total disaster.
And in 1948 dollars, the damage across the U.S. portion of the basin was over $100 million. So if you are a policymaker watching a wall of water destroy a city in a matter of hours, your entire worldview shifts instantly.
Right. The Vanport disaster became the massive political engine for basin-wide flood control, because prior to 1948, dam building in the region was mostly focused on power generation and aiding navigation.
Right.
But the tragedy at Vanport fueled the passage of the 1950 Flood Control Act, which fundamentally pivoted the entire strategy. Suddenly, damming the river was no longer just an economic exercise, it was a vital matter of public safety.
So they just started building massive concrete stoppers.
Exactly. The federal government funded a new generation of dams, like the Dalles and Priest Rapids. These structures were engineered specifically to hold back and meter out the spring freshets, that dangerous rush of snowmelt.
Okay.
So a surge like 1948 could literally never wipe out a city downstream again.
So when we look back and judge these dams today, with all of our modern ecological knowledge, we have to pause and ask a very sobering question. How many modern-day Vanports did they prevent from happening?
You can't just wave away the fact that they stopped killer floods.
You really can't. But the engineers realized that if you were going to build these massive concrete stoppers to hold back the spring floods, you're suddenly going to be left with incredibly deep, enormous reservoirs of trapped water sitting right in the middle of an arid landscape.
Right.
What do you do with it?
You turn a desert into a bread basket. This brings us to the 1902 Newlands Reclamation Act, which set the stage for how the federal government viewed the arid basins of the West long before Vanport. The whole vision was to engineer these dry valleys into agricultural powerhouses.
Okay, so like the Klamath project.
Exactly. Authorized just a few years later in 1905, it's a prime example of this philosophy in action. The Bureau of Reclamation used dam-fed diversion canals to pull water out of the river system and route it across the dry earth.
Just paving the desert with water.
Yeah. They turned a hostile basin into roughly 225,000 acres of incredibly fertile irrigated farmland.
I mean, just to put 225,000 acres into perspective, that is roughly the size of a massive county and entirely brought to life by human engineering.
Right.
Imagine your entire community, the foundation of your local economy, and literally the food on your table existing only because a canal routes water to the dust.
The human element of the credit column is profound here. From the perspective of those farming communities, Reclamation-era water is the singular lifeblood of their existence. Without it, the land reverts to high desert.
Yes, just sagebrush and dust.
Exactly. We're talking about generations of real families, real crops, potatoes, onions, alfalfa, and a massive supply of food for the nation that relies completely on this diverted water. Their homes, their livelihoods, and their generational wealth are entirely tethered to the operation of those dams.
And while the water was feeding the nation, the sheer physical force of the river was powering it. Let's talk about the electricity, because here is where the ledger numbers get truly staggering.
Oh, absolutely.
You have millions of gallons of water stacked up behind a concrete wall. Gravity naturally wants to pull that water down, so you force it through a turbine on its way down.
And the hydropower generated by these dams, managed and sold by the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA, provided some of the cheapest firm electricity in the entire nation.
How cheap are we talking?
We're looking at wholesale rates historically sitting in the rough range of just 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour.
Wow.
The underlying economics are simple but incredibly powerful. Once the massive upfront construction costs of pouring the concrete were largely paid off by the government, the fuel running the power plants was literally just falling water.
Right, the fuel was free.
It was free.
And when you introduce near-free electricity into an economy, industries flock to it like a magnet. Explain why this specific type of power was so crucial to the Pacific Northwest. Like, why did it attract aluminum smelting, for instance?
Well, producing aluminum from raw bauxite requires an astonishing amount of continuous, uninterrupted electricity. The smelting process is so energy-intensive that raw aluminum is sometimes referred to as congealed electricity.
Congealed electricity, that's a great term.
Right. And because the dams provided massive amounts of cheap, baseload power, meaning power that is always on, unlike solar or wind, which fluctuates. Companies like LCOA and Kaiser built massive smelters in the region.
And that fed directly into the war effort, didn't it?
Absolutely. That cheap power ran Boeing's wartime bomber plants, which were critical to the Allied effort in World War II.
Right.
It also powered the highly secretive Hanford nuclear complex, which produced plutonium for the Manhattan Project. The entire industrial and economic foundation of the modern Pacific Northwest was essentially built on the back of this incredibly cheap, abundant hydropower.
And it's not just history.
No, not at all. Even today, the 4 more modest dams on the lower Snake River alone produce an average of around 700 megawatts a year.
Okay, so we stopped cities from drowning, we watered the desert to feed the country, and we won a world war and built the jet age on falling water.
Yeah.
But the vision of these engineers was so expansive, they looked at these turbulent, rocky, impassable rivers and decided they could literally pave them with water for ships.
Right, inland navigation. It's the final massive entry in the credit column. By creating these enormous slack water pools behind a series of 8 different dams on the Columbia and the Snake Rivers, the Army Corps of Engineers essentially turned a free-flowing, dangerous river into a calm, navigable interstate highway for barges.
But the engineering required to achieve this is mind-bending to me. How do you move a massive, fully loaded grain barge hundreds of miles uphill against the natural flow of the earth?
You build a system of navigation locks.
Right.
A lock is essentially a massive concrete bathtub with watertight doors on both ends. A towboat pushes a barge into the lock, the doors close behind it, and millions of gallons of water are pumped in, floating thousands of tons of steel and cargo vertically up to the level of the next reservoir.
Like a water elevator.
Exactly. Then the doors in front open, and the barge sails out onto the next lake.
And thanks to that system, grain, timber, fuel, fertilizer, all of it can move by towboat from the open Pacific Ocean, stepping up those water elevators, all the way to the port of Lewiston, Idaho.
Lewiston, Idaho, which is 465 river miles inland from the ocean.
That's just wild.
It's the farthest inland seaport on the entire West Coast. That lock system was completed in 1975.
And it moves a lot of freight.
A huge amount. The logistical efficiency is remarkable. In a recent year, roughly 4 million tons of cargo moved on the Snake River alone, primarily agricultural grain heading to overseas markets.
And the environmental upside is significant, right?
Definitely. Moving that massive volume of freight by barge requires a tiny fraction of the diesel fuel and produces a tiny fraction of the carbon emissions compared to moving that exact same cargo by a massive fleet of commercial semi-trucks on the highway.
And as a byproduct of all this intense engineering, you just happen to get flat water recreation.
Yeah, a massive bonus.
By impounding these fast, dangerous rivers, you created hundreds of miles of flat, warm, accessible water. Millions of visitor days are logged for boating, water skiing, and lake fishing. It became a massive cultural and economic amenity for the people who live there.
Yeah, it completely reshaped the lifestyle of the region.
So when you look at this entire picture, it is basically a wildly successful planetary terraforming project. Humans looked at a wild, flood-prone, arid, incredibly dangerous landscape, and they meticulously engineered it into a safe, electrified, agricultural powerhouse with a massive shipping highway.
And none of these benefits are fictions or exaggerations.
No.
Every single one of them was a promised dividend that the dams actually delivered on. Real human safety, national security, food systems, and economic stability rest entirely on this infrastructure. The black ink on the ledger is thick, it's real, and it is vital to modern life.
If this were a mid-century PR brochure, we would stop right here, roll the credits, and celebrate the triumph of mankind over nature.
We really would.
But we are acting as accountants today. We have to flip the page and look at the red ink. Because while the concrete dams, the grain barges, and the lush green farms were bathed in sunlight, highly visible for everyone to admire, the real cost of this terraforming project was hidden.
Completely obscured.
It was down below the water surface, silently accumulating for an entire generation.
Right. When an ecosystem is fundamentally altered at a structural level like that, the biological consequences aren't always immediately visible to the people reaping the economic benefits up above.
Yeah.
The costs were deferred, basically pushed down the timeline and down the river.
So let's examine the vanishing millions. Let's look at the debit column.
Okay, so historically, before the first cubic yard of concrete was ever poured, the Columbia River Basin was one of the most prolific salmon ecosystems on the planet. Biological and historical estimates suggest that between 10 and 16 million wild salmon and steelhead return to the basin from the Pacific Ocean every single year.
10 to 16 million.
10 to 15 million fish, returning like absolute clockwork.
Wow.
Today, that number sits at roughly 2.5 million.
Okay, but we have to clarify what that 2.5 million number actually represents, because it's not a direct comparison to the historical wild fish, is it?
Not at all. The vast majority of those 2.5 million returning fish today are hatchery fish. They are bred in concrete raceways, fed pellets, and released by the millions just to sustain the commercial and tribal fisheries. They are a manufactured replacement, not wild fish spawning naturally in mountain gravel beds.
So what about the wild fish?
If you look at the 16 distinct stocks of salmon that historically spawned above the Bonneville Dam, several are already completely extinct. Many more are severely imperiled. Most of the surviving wild populations are sitting below 5% of their pre-1850s historical levels.
Under 5%.
Yeah, and some of the Snake River stocks have collapsed below 1% of their historic numbers.
Less than 1%. I mean, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which is a regional planning agency, not some radical activist group, they estimate that the dam infrastructure in the basin accounts for a staggering loss of 5 to 11 million fish every single year. They just cease to exist.
And this collapse is extensively documented legally and federally. According to NOAA Fisheries, there are now 13 different groups of salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin listed under the Endangered Species Act.
13 groups.
Yeah, and notably, earlier counts used to say 12 groups. So the number of threatened species is growing, not shrinking.
Wow.
Every single one of those 13 ESA listings is a formal declaration by the federal government that a specific, unique run of fish, a genetic lineage that has adapted to a specific tributary over thousands of years, is at imminent risk of being wiped off the face of the earth.
Now, for a lot of people, sitting in a modern air-conditioned city, using cheap electricity to charge their devices, a fish population statistic is just abstract. It's just a tragic number in a NOAA spreadsheet.
Right, it doesn't affect their day-to-day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we have to integrate the perspective of the indigenous peoples of the region, the Yurok, the Karuk, the Klamath tribes, and the Columbia River Treaty tribes. For them, these invisible costs were profoundly, devastatingly visible.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about cultures, religions, and economies that have been anchored to these salmon runs since time immemorial. The fish are their sustenance, their spiritual identity, and their livelihood.
Yep.
And over just a few decades, they had to watch their ancient inheritance fall to fractions of a single percent. The ledger for them didn't just have a few debts. Their entire side of the ledger was completely bankrupted to pay for the other side's prosperity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to understand why the fish disappeared so catastrophically, we have to look past the obvious blockades. It wasn't just that a dam is a physical wall blocking a fish from swimming upstream.
Right, because we have fish ladders.
Exactly. While fish ladders, which are basically a series of stepped pools that allow some fish to jump their way past the dam, they do help a percentage of adults migrate, but they don't solve the underlying problem.
So what's the real problem?
The dams change the fundamental physics of the water itself and the earth it flows over.
So how does a dam actually kill a fish beyond just being a concrete wall? Like, let's dive into the mechanics of this. How did they alter the physics of the ecosystem?
Okay, so the first major physical alteration is sediment starvation. A natural, free-flowing river is essentially a massive, continuous geological conveyor belt. As water rushes down from the mountains, it constantly carries silt, sand, and varying sizes of gravel miles and miles downstream, eventually depositing it in the ocean. But a dam acts as a colossal, inescapable sediment trap.
Because the water stops moving.
Exactly. All that gravel and silt hits the slow-moving water behind the concrete face of the dam, and it simply sinks to the bottom of the reservoir.
So the conveyor belt is broken. The water passing through the dam is suddenly empty, entirely starved of the earth it used to carry.
Right. And this creates a devastating two-front war on the ecosystem. Upstream of the dam, the natural gravel beds that adult salmon absolutely require to lay their eggs, they dig nests called redds in this specific size of gravel. Those beds are no longer being replenished by the mountain runoff.
Oh, I see.
The spawning grounds are literally starved of building materials.
And what happens downstream?
Downstream, at the mouth of the river where it meets the Pacific Ocean, the millennia-old beaches, sandbars, and estuaries that were built by that constant flow of sediment, they begin to simply erode away into the ocean.
Because the ocean currents keep washing the sand away, but the river is no longer replacing it.
Exactly. You are starving the river's origins and its terminus at the exact same time.
Wow. And it isn't just the dirt and gravel that changes. It's the physical nature of the water itself. A wild river, the kind these salmon evolved in over millions of years, is fast and it is cold.
Very cold.
It is constantly churning, mixing in oxygen as it crashes over rocks, and staying chilled by the sheer speed of its flow in the shade of the deep canyons. But what happens when you build a dam? You take that fast, cold, oxygen-rich river, you spread it out over thousands of acres to create a reservoir, and you just let it sit there.
Yeah, you turn a dynamic river into a series of stagnant, slack-water lakes. And when you spread water out and significantly slow its velocity, you allow the ambient air and the summer sun to bake it.
Right.
Warm, slow water is fundamentally antithetical to cold water species like wild salmon. They experience severe physiological stress when temperatures rise. But unfortunately, warm, slow water is the absolute perfect environment for almost everything that harms them.
You essentially terraformed a river for human benefit, but in the process, you accidentally built a giant, stagnant solar oven.
That's a great way to put it.
So what does a warm slackwater reservoir actually breed?
Well, one of the most immediate visible impacts is toxic algae. These warm, slow, incredibly nutrient-rich waters behind the dams, often fed by agricultural runoff from the farms we talked about earlier, they became ideal habitats for cyanobacteria, commonly known as blue-green algae.
Oh, yeah.
We have seen massive recurring blooms on the Columbia Basin impoundments and historically on the old Klamath River reservoirs. And these blooms aren't just an ugly, grain aesthetic nuisance on the surface of the water.
They are biologically dangerous.
Highly dangerous. The Environmental Protection Agency heavily tracks this spreading problem because these cyanobacteria produce microcystins and other toxins that are incredibly potent.
How potent?
They are strong enough to force public health officials to close entire miles of shoreline to human contact. And they are lethal enough to kill dogs that happen to swim in the water or drink from the edges of the reservoir.
So you build a dam for recreation, and you end up with water so toxic it can kill a golden retriever just for taking a swim.
Yeah.
But the algae isn't even the most insidious thing lurking in that warm water, is it? Let's go deeper into the biology here. Let's talk about the microscopic killer that truly exposes how the ledger was warped. Ceratinovis shasta.
Right. Ceratinovis shasta is a microscopic myxozoan parasite, and its life cycle is a brilliant, deadly piece of evolutionary biology that perfectly exploited the exact artificial conditions the dams created, particularly on the Klamath River.
Explain how this invisible nightmare actually operates on a cellular level. How does it get into the salmon?
The parasite's life cycle is complex. It actually requires an intermediate host to survive and multiply. In this case, the intermediate host is a tiny microscopic polychaete worm that lives in the sediment of the riverbed.
Okay, worm.
Right. The parasite infects these worms, replicates inside them, and then is released by the millions into the water column as tiny free-floating spores. When juvenile salmon swim downstream toward the ocean, these spores attach to their gills or skin, penetrate their tissues, and migrate directly to their intestines.
That sounds horrific. Once it reaches the intestines, what happens to the fish?
It causes a lethal necrotizing intestinal disease.
What's that, man?
Yeah. The parasite aggressively feeds on the intestinal tissue, essentially destroying the fish's digestive tract from the inside out. The fish stops eating, becomes lethargic, and usually dies before it ever reaches the ocean.
And how do the dams factor into this?
Here is the critical connection. The entire life cycle of this parasite, its ability to infect the worms, multiply, and infect the fish, is highly dependent on water temperature and flow velocity. When a natural river is flowing fast and cold, the parasite spores are quickly flushed out to sea, and the cold water keeps the replication rates inside the worms very low.
Okay, so let me deduce the flip side of that. By slowing the river down into a slack water pool and letting the summer sun heat it up to 70 degrees, the spores aren't flushed away.
Right.
They just accumulate, and the heat acts like an accelerant for their replication.
Exactly.
The engineers who poured the concrete in the 1930s and 50s obviously didn't invent this microscopic parasite, but by fundamentally changing the physics of the water, they effectively engineered the ideal sun-warmed breeding ground for it to absolutely explode in population.
The warmer the water, the exponentially faster the infection spreads, and the more lethal it becomes. It is a perfect clinical example of an invisible cost.
Yeah.
You can stand on the edge of a beautiful, calm reservoir reflecting the summer sun, and you see a triumph of engineering. You see a great place to go water skiing and cheap electricity humming in the transmission lines. But beneath the surface, completely out of sight, the water chemistry and biology have shifted so radically that the native juvenile fish are literally being eaten alive from the inside.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second. We're accountants trying to be objective here.
Sure.
Whenever we talk about the decline of salmon, there are always a lot of factors at play. Couldn't a skeptic look at that ledger and say, wait a minute, salmon are anadromous. They spend years out in the open ocean before coming back. What about shifting ocean temperatures and changing food webs? What about the massive commercial fishing fleets over-harvesting them in the Pacific? What about all the other habitat loss from logging and urban development? Are the dams really the primary culprit here, or just one of many equally weighted debits?
It's a fair question, and a rigorous scientific ledger has to acknowledge all those factors. Ocean conditions fluctuate dramatically. Historical overharvesting by commercial fleets was a massive problem. And destroying estuary habitats through urban development certainly harms salmon survival. Those are all real, measurable debits.
Right.
However, there is an undeniable foundational piece of biological evidence that points to the dam infrastructure as the primary overriding toll.
What is the undeniable proof that separates the dams from the ocean conditions?
Look at the specific runs of salmon that were completely 100% blocked by massive dams built without any fish ladders at all, like Chief Joseph Dam or Grand Coulee.
Okay.
Those distinct genetic runs of fish didn't just decline by 50% due to poor ocean conditions. They went completely extinct. They absolutely ended. When you physically block a river, the fish native to the upper tributaries cease to exist, regardless of how favorable the ocean is.
That's a huge point.
Furthermore, you have to weigh those other variables against the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's own calculation. As a regional planning agency, their estimate specifically isolates and attributes a loss of 5 to 11 million fish directly to the development and operation of the hydropower system. The ocean matters, the harvest matters, but the concrete walls and the slack, warm water are the dominant, unavoidable features of the salmon's decline.
So for decades, this was the quiet status quo. The power was incredibly cheap, the farms were watered, and the salmon runs were quietly, invisibly dying out beneath the surface of the reservoirs. The ledger looked perfectly fine if you only checked the balance sheet in the daylight.
Yeah, if you didn't look too closely.
But then we arrive at the hinge of our story. We arrive at the moment where the two columns of this ledger violently collided in broad daylight. Let's talk about the Klamath River in 2002.
The 2002 Klamath River fish kill is the historical moment. The abstract, slow-moving biological tragedy became an undeniable, highly visible reality. But to truly grasp the mechanics of 2002, we actually have to quickly rewind the timeline 1 year to the summer of 2001.
Okay, the basin experiences cyclical droughts. What happened in 2001 that set the stage?
In 2001, there was a severe water shortage across the Klamath Basin. The federal government, specifically operating under the mandates of the Endangered Species Act to protect the imperiled fish in the river, made an incredibly controversial management decision.
What'd they do?
They decided to hold water back in the river for the fish and severely cut off irrigation deliveries to the Klamath Project farmers.
Oh, wow. And the farming communities erupted.
Completely erupted.
We're talking about families watching their multi-generational farms literally dry up and blow away in the wind.
The economic and emotional devastation for the agricultural community was intense. You had massive protests, tractor convoys blocking roads, and the famous bucket brigades, where thousands of citizens symbolically passed buckets of water from the river to the dry irrigation canals.
Yeah, I remember seeing footage of that.
It was a highly publicized, deeply visceral political and economic crisis. Their livelihoods were drying up in the dust, and they demanded federal intervention.
So the political pressure heading into the very next year is just immense. The government knows they cannot afford another summer of dry canals and angry farmers, which brings us to the winter of 2001 into 2002.
Right, and that winter was terribly dry. The mountain snowpack was dismal. By early spring, 2002 was shaping up to be another severe drought year.
Oh, wow.
But this time, facing immense political pressure, the federal government reversed its course.
On April 1st, 2002, officials from the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of the Interior physically arrived at the Klamath Project to ceremonially open the headgates.
Yeah, it was a big event.
They officially prioritized a full irrigation season for those 225,000 acres of farmland, despite the severe drought conditions.
Right.
And this highlights the agonizing reality of a zero-sum game.
Right.
A zero-sum game means there is a finite, fixed amount of a resource. If one side gets a gallon, the other side mathematically loses a gallon. There was no magical hidden reservoir to draw from. Water sent through the diversion canals to save the farmers meant a dangerously, unprecedentedly low river left behind for the fish. A gallon for the corn is a gallon stolen from the salmon.
And this decision effectively set the stage for a lethal biological explosion that September.
Because the adult salmon don't know anything about water politics or drought declarations. Their biological clock just tells them it's time to go home. So what happens when they return in September?
September is when the adult fall Chinook salmon return from the Pacific Ocean, swimming upstream into the lower Klamath River to spawn in their natal gravel beds. And in 2002, it was an unusually large run of returning adults.
Yeah, so a lot of fish.
A ton of fish. But when they entered the lower river, they encountered an absolute nightmare. Because the water had been diverted all summer to the agricultural fields, the river flows were incredibly low. We were talking around 980 cubic feet per second at the specific reach where the die-off happened.
That's the trickle compared to the deep, fast river they evolved to navigate.
Exactly. And because the river was so incredibly shallow, the late summer sun had completely baked the water. The river temperatures spiked up to about 72 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
For a cold water salmon, 72 degrees is essentially a hot bath. It causes extreme physiological stress, suppressing their immune systems.
I want you to imagine the sheer physical horror of this.
Yeah.
It's like taking thousands of exhausted marathon runners who have just pushed their bodies to the absolute limit, running 26 miles, and crowding all of them into a tiny, unventilated, overheated closet right in the middle of peak flu season.
That's a perfect analogy.
Their immune systems are already shot from the physical exertion of the migration. They are packed shoulder to shoulder in the shallow pools, breathing on each other. It is a biological disaster just waiting for a microscopic spark.
And the conditions were ripe, and the spark was disease. The warm water and extreme crowding caused an explosion of naturally occurring pathogens. Specifically, a bacterial gill rot infection known as columnaris and the ciliated protozoan parasite known as itch.
That's the parasite that looks like tiny white grains of salt on a fish in a home aquarium.
No,
right?
exactly.
But here it's happening on a massive lethal scale in the wild.
Right. These pathogens swept through the densely packed, immune-compromised population like a wildfire. And the result was catastrophic. In a single week, tens of thousands of adult salmon simply suffocated as the parasites destroyed their gills. They died and washed up on the shallow gravel bars of the lower Klamath River.
It remains the largest adult salmon die-off ever recorded in the western United States.
It's staggering.
The images from that week are haunting. It wasn't an abstract ESA listing anymore. It wasn't a biological study hidden in an academic journal. It was miles and miles of rotting fish carcasses piled up in the shallow water and baking on the rocks. The invisible cost had finally washed ashore for the entire world to see.
Yeah, you couldn't ignore it.
Let's look at the actual numbers. How many dead fish are we talking about?
Well, this is where we have to be very careful and look at how the ledger is calculated, because there is a disputed tally between the federal and tribal authorities. The official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimate stated that roughly 34,000 fish died. Their analysis attributed at least 33,000 of those deaths directly to the lethal conditions in the river.
34,000 dead adult salmon rotting in the sun. I mean, that is an astronomical biological loss for an already endangered ecosystem. But that is just the lower bound of the estimates, isn't it?
Yes. Independent biologists and the biological teams from the local tribes conducted their own extensive counts, and their numbers ran far higher. The commonly cited independent estimates reach roughly 68,000 to over 70,000 dead adult fish.
How does an accounting discrepancy of over 30,000 dead fish happen?
It comes down to survey methodology.
Oh, interesting.
The official federal count heavily relied on visible carcasses, but washed up on the banks and the gravel bars where they could be easily counted by surveyors walking the shoreline.
Right.
But the independent and tribal counts attempted to calculate the total overall mortality by factoring in the physics of the river and the local wildlife.
So they looked at the whole picture.
Exactly. They mathematically accounted for the carcasses that sank to the deep bottom of the river, as well as the thousands of dead fish that were quickly carried off by scavengers, eagles, bears, and raccoons before they could ever be manually counted by a human walking the shoreline.
And as honest accountants, we aren't going to take a side on which specific number is the absolute truth. because frankly, it doesn't change the fundamental reality of the event.
No, it doesn't.
Whether it was 34,000 dead fish or 70,000 dead fish, it represents a catastrophic failure of the biological ledger, an entire generation of a species wiped out in days.
Exactly.
But this brings us to the most crucial, uncomfortable question of this entire deep dive. Natural disasters happen. The 1948 Vanport flood was an act of nature, a terrifying alignment of weather and snowpack.
Right.
But was the 2002 Klamath fish kill an act of nature? Or was it a managed outcome?
To answer that, we turn directly to the official government findings. This is not our editorializing. This is the stated conclusion of a federal agency. Between 2003 and 2004, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released its final comprehensive analysis of the contributing factors to the die-off, and they stated the mechanics plainly. The kill resulted from a combination of the low river flows, the elevated water temperatures, the crowded return of the fish, and the resulting disease outbreak.
And the critical piece of that equation, the domino that started the chain reaction.
The low flows. The official report explicitly identified that the low flows were a major contributing factor. The proximate medical cause of death was disease, and the condition that allowed the disease to explode was the warm, crowded water, but the water was low specifically because it had been diverted away from the river and sent to the agricultural fields.
So it was a managed outcome.
Yes.
The river was low because humans opened a gate to make it low, which means there is a chain of decision. And we're going to trace that chain of command right now, entirely neutrally, based strictly on the public record and political reporting. We aren't here as prosecutors looking for a villain. We're just opening the books to see who signed the ledger.
Right. The mechanics of the decision are well documented. Operationally, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is the agency that runs the physical Klamath project, and it literally sets the water deliveries.
Okay.
At a higher policy level, the Department of the Interior, which at the time was led by Secretary Gail Norton, directed the water to the farmers for that 2002 irrigation season. That was the federal policy directive that led to the headgates opening on April 1st.
And the political reporting traces the pressure even higher than the cabinet level, doesn't it?
It does. In 2007, a major investigative series by the Washington Post reported that Vice President Dick Cheney had intervened behind the scenes, heavily pressing the Interior Department for the full irrigation deliveries to the farmers to alleviate the political pressure from the 2001 protests.
Wow.
That investigative reporting was significant enough that it eventually prompted a congressional inquiry to examine the exact roles of the Interior Department and the Vice President's office in overriding standard environmental protocols.
Right.
Now, it's important to state clearly that this political dimension is presented exactly as it was reported by journalists and examined by Congress. It is not a matter of a criminal courtroom conviction.
Of course.
The universally documented agency-stated fact is the physical cause of the kill. The degree of any specific politician's personal culpability is a matter of that public record and reporting.
But here's the detail that absolutely haunts me about this chain of decision, and it's the thing that really defines the modern era of river management. The terrifying part isn't the names of the politicians. It's the intent.
Yeah.
Were they flying blind? When they opened those headgates in April, did they know what was going to happen in the river in September?
They were warned, repeatedly and explicitly.
Serious.
Yes. Tribal biologists, federal fisheries scientists, and even outside scientific review panels warned policymakers beforehand that cutting the river flows so drastically during a severe drought year would crowd the fish, raise the temperatures, and severely endanger the returning salmon.
And this right here is the philosophical shift of the entire era. When the engineers of the 1930s poured the concrete for the Bonneville Dam, or when they passed the 1950 Flood Control Act after Vanport, they might have genuinely operated in a state of blind ignorance.
Oh, almost certainly.
They probably didn't fully understand the complex physics of sediment starvation and how it ruins an estuary. They certainly didn't know the precise, microscopic life cycle of the Ceratodonova Shasta parasite and how a warm reservoir would act as a massive incubator. They were singularly focused on stopping deadly floods and powering wartime factories.
Right. Their ignorance was, in many ways, an unintended byproduct of the era's science. They were building the future with the knowledge they had at the time.
Right. But by 2002, the science was completely unambiguous. The biology was understood, the mechanics of flow and temperature were known, the warnings were issued in writing. The decision to cut the river flows and prioritize the farmland was made with full prior knowledge of the immense biological risks. It was a conscious shift from mid-century accidental ignorance to deliberate modern political indifference. Policymakers looked at the ledger, saw the staggering cost to the fish and the tribes, and consciously decided it was a price they were willing to pay to keep the farms watered.
And the tragic irony is that for decades, society didn't even have to look at the price because the immense scale of the river hid it so well. We cannot forget the credits the dams saved cities from devastating floods.
They did.
They turned barren desert into hundreds of thousands of acres of productive farmland that feeds the country. They floated millions of tons of grain on barges to ports hundreds of miles inland, drastically reducing emissions, and they provided the cheapest baseload electricity in the country, powering the nation through wars and into the modern age. Those were monumental achievements.
But they achieved it by quietly, invisibly drowning a multi-million fish ecosystem. They starved the ancient gravel beds, poisoned the estuaries, bred lethal parasites in stagnant water, and bankrupted the cultures of the river tribes. Until September 2002, when the water finally dropped low enough, the river heated up, and the ledger violently balanced itself in the form of tens of thousands of dead salmon rotting in the autumn sun.
It was the moment the invisible became undeniably, uncomfortably visible. It forced a reckoning with how we calculate the true cost of human infrastructure.
So as we close the books on this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. In economics, there's a fundamental concept called an uncosted externality. It's a cost that is generated by a business or a project, but it is paid by a third party, completely off the official books.
Right.
When the titans of mid-century engineering built these massive dams, the benefits, the incredibly cheap electricity, the massive crop yields, the efficient barge freight, were meticulously priced out in dollars and cents and proudly written into the credit column in thick black ink.
Yeah.
But the costs, the extinction of wild salmon runs, the devastation of ancient tribal economies, the erosion of the coastline were completely left off the balance sheet. They were uncosted externalities, paid for by the river itself. So if an accountant only tracks the profits in black ink and completely ignores the massive biological debts hidden beneath the waterline, did the ledger of the American West ever actually balance in the first place?
Answering that question redefines exactly what we mean when we talk about human progress.
It's the stark difference between the mathematical precision of an accountant's math and the muddy, complicated waters of biological reality. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.